This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. From a 20-year military occupation at the beginning of the last century, through the Reagan-era Iran-Contra affair, and the more recent fall and return of the Sandinista movement, the U.S. has continued to play a role in the economic and political development of Nicaragua. Our guest today has just returned from an assignment there and is here to provide some context for the ongoing relations between Washington and Managua. Peter Kranstover is a development economist with 30 years of international experience in the areas of economic development, development finance, and implementing economic assistance strategies abroad. He began his work in Central America as a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala and has lived in Honduras, Costa Rica, and El Salvador as a Foreign Service Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's also served as Director of Central American and Mexican Affairs for USAID, Director of Development for the U.S. Committee on Refugees and Immigrants, and as a policy advisor on Latin America for the Office of Foreign Assistance at the U.S. Department of State. Peter, welcome to International Focus.
Thanks very much, Doug. Pleasure to be here.
Well, and welcome back, I should say. And perhaps a good place to start is just refreshing our viewers' geography. We've got a map here of the region.
Great.
We could take a look at. So
there we are.
There we are, center of Central American Isthmus. And how has its position affected some of the history we're about to talk about?
Well, you know, in the 19th century, of course, it was focused in on because Cornelius Vanderbilt wanted a route across the isthmus for all the people who were coming from the East Coast to get over to California for the gold rush. So that border, if you will, between Costa Rica and Nicaragua that you see there on the south was essentially served as half of the trek over there to the other side to the Pacific. And that's when we, if you will, started to pay attention to Nicaragua as a place really that served as a bridge between the seas. And of course, in the past, in this last century, beginning in about 1908, 1909, when we started to get interested in basically a civil war between the conservatives and the liberals there in Nicaragua, because we were interested in getting some customs receipts from them. We eventually brought Marines in and stayed there for almost 20 years, leaving in 1933 after we had basically established the National Guard there, which of course the Somozas took over and used really as their own Praetorian Guard for up until July of 1979 when the Sandinistas, who are currently in power, took over. A nice graphic there of the Marines coming in, led by the only double Medal of Honor winner in our history, a fellow by the name of Smedley Butler, who was so fed up after he retired from the Army, you should know, that he wrote a book called War is a Racket, and went around the states talking about U.S. imperial designs and things like this because of what he had seen there in Nicaragua, and interpreted that as essentially being you know, a war that we had waged in order to make places safe for business.
Well, one of the things you mentioned was the Somoza family. I think we've got a shot of one of our past U.S. leaders and one of the many Somozas. If we could just go to that slide. And we should mention it. It's hard to overestimate the impact of that particular family. Here's Richard Nixon and Anastasio Somoza from
And Anastasio,
1971.
right, the second generation, and the second brother who took over from the original Somoza in the 30s, and who was ousted then in July of '79 by the Sandinistas. It's his father is, of course, famous or infamous, depending on your optic. But is the term or the phrase is sometimes attributed to, I've seen it attributed to both FDR as well as to Truman, whereby someone was saying, this guy Somoza in Nicaragua is really bad, and he's really not doing much for the people down there, and he really is an SOB. And it was either Roosevelt or Truman who said that, yes, but he's our SOB. And so we essentially allowed things, as we did in a lot of ways in Latin America and continue to do, frankly, in many regards, dealt with those countries, not unreasonably from a strategic standpoint, as we wished and as we could. And the '79 revolution that brought in the Sandinistas, inspired by the Cubans, as most leftist insurgencies or movements certainly in Latin America have been in the latter part of the 20th century, by Cuba, then sought to establish, a completely different economic and social structure there, and indeed didn't do very well during the '80s for any number of reasons.
And our response, of course, was to fund a insurgency against the government. I think that's our next slide.
Right, right. So we had the Contras coming out of essentially western or rather eastern and southern Honduras, as well as northern Costa Rica at the time, which had a core of probably about 30,000 ex-National Guardsmen who had served under the Somoza regime. But it also had any number of disillusioned peasants who had originally supported the Sandinistas and who had been badly treated by that regime, certainly out in the Atlantic part of the country as well as in the northern part.
Well, if you look at that photo from 1987, one thing that strikes us is just how young these people are.
Yes, right. Well, and the youth, as in a lot of insurgencies, and as frankly they continue to be the backbone of the Sandinistas as we speak in Nicaragua, did drop out of school, drop out of university, drop out of their disappeared essentially from their families, and decided to join the insurgency. Ortega, who's currently in power as we speak, Daniel, is a high school dropout himself and spent 4 or 5 years in jail, although never apparently actually was in the field with a gun.
Well, we've got one more slide that's more squarely in your particular bailiwick, and that's a program that the USAID is involved with now. The woman in the slide is apparently repairing a outboard motor as part of a vocational training.
I could only imagine that she's out there on the East Coast in the semi-autonomous regions there and along the Atlantic coast, where fishing and having a boat, is essential for your livelihood. So your tax money and mine has been in foreign assistance programs there in Nicaragua in one form or another since '61, really. Although in the past couple of years, our portfolio is greatly diminished, particularly if you compare it to 1990, 91, 92, 93, when Violeta Chamorro came in and took over after 10 years of Sandinista rule there. $200 to $300 million of what we call ESF funds went in there in order to support the government and go into the central bank, and was dispersed, according to an agreement, of course, that was negotiated with them. But at the moment, the 2018 budget, and this is what I found so striking upon visiting Nicaragua again, is currently zero. And that's the executive branch's indication in a number of different forms of what they think about Nicaragua at the moment. And it's frankly understandable given where Ortega stands on a number of things and his affiliation with particularly with Venezuela, if not the Cubans, and frankly the Bolivians too, who form a grouping now known as ALBA, which is the Alianza de Liberación, if I'm not mistaken, de Bolivariana de las Americas, right? Which is sort of a counterpart, if you will, to the OAS, to stretch it a little bit, perhaps.
So let's talk a little bit about just the basics of the situation now. how many people are we talking about as population of the country?
Right. It's a little over 6 million people, and the country's about the size of the state of New York. But the population's about the size, about that of Wisconsin's, and it's the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. Although, in gross, without disaggregating, you've got about a $2,000 to $2,100 a year per capita income there, which, not too long ago was less than $1,000. So their economic growth has been pretty good over the past 4 or 5, 6 years. A lot of that has to do with cash infusions from the Venezuelans, just blank checks, frankly, that go into this a bit of a black box called ALBA. And El Salvador has a similar arrangement too. It's uncertain exactly how much happens to be in that particular checking account, since the funds have diminished since oil has gone down. It's about $60 a barrel right now. And when it started, Chavez was selling it for about $130 to $140 a barrel. So he was pretty flush. But the point is that Ortega and the Sandinistas, and in particular a guy named Francisco Lopez, who's sort of the money guy in the regime, have pretty much carte blanche to use that money the way they wish. It's not appropriated, it's not tax funds, the people don't have anything to say about it really, but that you're a high-ranking Sandinista government official.
Well, what about the economy itself, sort of macroeconomic terms? I mean, where does the income come from?
Sure, so it's not, it's still pretty much primary product producing country. So you've got, coffee is still its largest export. We're their biggest trading partner, interestingly enough. But you've got coffee, sugarcane, rice, cattle, things like this. A little bit of light manufacturing, but not particularly significant, actually. And because of that, you don't have a lot of value added in what it is that you're making, if you will, in your country. And so you don't have a lot of if you will, to have a lot of backward linkages or forward linkages, not to sound too wonky, but which would provide employment. And that the private sector, however, has been, which is interestingly enough and somewhat surprising to me in any case, very close to this particular regime, despite their opposition over the years, is investing in tourism and certainly doing a lot with respect to housing and infrastructure and things like this. So that and tourism, which has just sort of taken off over the past 3 to 5 years, is really an interesting sector, because it's, North Americans and Western Europeans, more or less my age, if you will, have all of a sudden discovered the beaches there, and really, the nice atmosphere, frankly, there. And it's a relatively safe country in terms of the Central American Isthmus, and a fact that the Sandinistas play up quite a bit. And the private sector likes predictability, and nobody wants to be a tourist, right, in a dangerous place. So that's coming along a bit. They're nowhere close to a place like Costa Rica, which is much more sophisticated in that regard.
So let's talk about sort of the earlier days of U.S. involvement. Other than being a potential point of passage for Cornelius Vanderbilt,
right.
What first brought Americans there?
Well, so it was that, but it was also coffee and some American, also interestingly enough, some German investment there around the turn of the century. But precious woods, mining, which still goes on a little bit up there in the Northeast, in a place, appropriately enough called Las Minas or Bonanza, a relatively isolated area up there in the Northeast, and of course. An interest really, as I think is true of most of our relations with Latin America, in maintaining, a good neighbor policy towards Nicaragua as well as other countries. And the Cold War, of course, as you well know, drove a lot of this. We were not interested in having these countries as small and as strategically, perhaps, insignificant as they might be in comparison to Europe. Or Asia, essentially take on a model of economic development or of political ideology that was antithetical to ours. Interestingly, however, in '79 when the Sandinistas took over, Carter basically did two things. He decided that money should still go to the Sandinistas because the junta that took over was a relatively diverse group, from center right to far left, and secondly, but at the same time he also signed an executive finding that the intelligence agencies should determine some type of way to basically undermine the Sandinista regime, knowing full well that there were one or two people on that junta at the time, particularly Tomás Borges, who was really quite left, were rather doctrinaire in their interpretation of the revolution. And the security service that was set up there, was done by the Cubans and the Bulgarians, and everybody was around there in the early '80s. But while we're giving $75 million over, from 80 to perhaps 82, 83, something like this, as it was being dispersed, another grouping of the federal government, is pursuing this clandestine war out of Honduras and Costa Rica. And so those two things certainly, played off each other and provided a little bit of friction in Washington.
Well, let's back up to the immediately preceding era. We had a slide of Richard Nixon and Somoza. Talk a little bit about the U.S. government's relationship with various Somozas over the years.
Yeah, we've always been able to, certainly, we've trained the National Guard. Somoza Anastasio, who you saw there, went to West Point, and our concern was stability, and so our aid programs there sought to attack poverty. They sought to offer some more economic and social opportunity for a relatively large sector of society that is of subsistence agricultural character.
But were those goals shared by the Somozas over the years?
Well, and they, I think, sort of tolerated us because they had such a great investment in various things. It's perhaps better described, instead of a capitalist sort of model that he had, as a mercantilist kind of operation, whereby he owned the cement making and he had what they call the adoquinado factory, which is basically your cobblestones to make your roads and in the villages and things like this. He had vast land holdings for rice and sugarcane and cattle and things like this. And so anything that was done in terms of private sector investment, had to at least be consistent or congruent with the kinds of things that he was interested in. It isn't the kind of capitalist model you and I have grown up with, but it's one that perhaps best reflected, some real structural problems in a country like Nicaragua, and frankly in most of Latin America, where you've got, and it's a vestige from the colonialists, from the Spaniards, who put in these vast estates called latifundios, which were essentially taken over and given to people who had served the crown. And not only did they get those vast extensions of land to produce, whatever they wanted, and usually these export products, but they also got the people who happen to be on those lands. And so you have this arrangement whereby you essentially have your captured labor grouping there, and you can produce what you want, and the way you want. So Nicaragua, like El Salvador, although El Salvador's concentration, was amongst a few more families than just the Somozas, but nonetheless you have this real apex sort of arrangement whereby the Somozas are essentially in the financial sector and certainly in the productive sector, sort of calling the shots. We were okay with that. We were willing to, and as we were in many other countries, willing to let that go.
But at some point, the population was not okay with it, and hence we have the Sandinistas. Talk a little bit about their rights.
And so they were formed in 1959, 1960 by a fellow named Mayorga, another Carlos Fonseca, and a fellow named Tomas Borges, who was on the junta then in the 80s. The other two, Mayorga and Fonseca, had died. And in an effort, and inspired again by the Cuban Revolution, to overthrow the Somozas. They were inspired by Sandino in his fight against the Marines in the 1930s. And they were concerned that this type of, this clubby kind of arrangement that the Somozas had there regarding everything not prevail. And so Borges was the only fellow to survive that 20-year, from 59, 60 up until 79. And, but they were able to, and got a little assistance certainly from the Cubans. Fonseca went to Moscow in 59, if I'm not mistaken, maybe a bit earlier.
It certainly would set off alarm bells in Washington.
And somebody knew about that. So, but they, like a lot of those ideologically fundamental sort of leftist movements at the time, were fiercely disciplined. There's a great book by a fellow named Omar Cabezas called Fire in the Mountain, where he talks about the organizational structure that they put into place in the 60s and the 70s. And that is what you have, interestingly enough for me, and what I saw on this most recent trip, is basically what you have in the Ortega regime as we speak. He was in power for about 10 years, although president from 85 to 90. And when he lost the elections in 90 to Chamorro, who was center-right, but who was on the original junta with him, he said, well, we'll rule from below. We'll rule from below with my party, which is 30 to 35% of the population, of the voting population, basically. And essentially jettisoned an opportunity for some type of coming together of political forces in the country. It really lost a great opportunity for bringing things together. Then you had a corrupt guy by the name of Aleman, who was elected for 5 years, and his vice president Bolaños, who was a little bit better, who came in for 5 years. And then you've got Ortega running and coming in 2008, and he's taking power. He's elected in 07. And he's going to be in until 2022, because in 09, he did a couple of things. One, he 08, 09, he marginalized the opposition through the Supreme Court. And then he got the Assembly to basically say that, oh, well, presidents here can actually succeed themselves. Now, this is significant because his wife happens to be the vice president. And so there's talk, of course, that she's going to be running in 2022, so she could conceivably stay in power for 10 years. And then their son, Laureano, who's 38, 39 years old as we speak, apparently has some political ambitions also.
So then, there's certainly official Washington is probably less than thrilled with that prospect. And as you mentioned, the aid budget is essentially zeroed out thereafter.
Well, one way to show the Nicaraguans, that Washington is not particularly pleased. Another way, though, and this has just happened recently, is that, and this is where it gets a little dark, but the Magnitsky Act, which was approved by Obama in 2012 and named after the Russian investor and private sector guy who was tortured and murdered in Moscow, has been amended to essentially appropriate, if not certainly block, any sort of financial transactions by people who Treasury, through their Office of Foreign Assets Control, the OFAC group there, from using ill-begotten gains, whether they be from their own country or any other place. Rivas, a fellow by the name of Roberto Rivas, while I was there, was taken off of his position as the head of the Election Commission, which is he's essentially served as Ortega's rubber stamp guy for the municipal as well as national elections. And so you've got the Magnitsky Act, which prevents us in some ways as a foreign assistance grouping from doing stuff down there. And then there are two other prohibitions that are a little bit arcane, but
well, we've got just a couple minutes left. So where we step out, oftentimes we see a similar story. The Chinese have stepped in. So talk a little bit about this proposed canal.
Yeah, and they certainly, I mean, they came on, and the Assembly basically gave them a long-term concession, perhaps the 50-year concession, to take a look at the canal. And I don't know if you can go back to your map there, but it won't follow the route of the original one. And but since they signed this up,
Yeah, sure.
thank you. Yeah, it's they haven't done much, and the Nicaraguan government has formed a parastatal grouping, the Canal Commission, to take a look at this. But environmental issues have essentially been shunted aside. This is not a piece of legislation that the people have been able to comment on or see. And most ironically, you know, a lot of people who supported the Sandinistas, peasants certainly out there in where the canal is going to go through, it's going to go right through the middle of the country, coming off of the big lake there, are very much concerned about this, because they don't call it eminent domain, but that's what's going to be used in order to take their lands. You're talking about people who need their land because that's where they grow their food.
Well, the Chinese know a fair amount about that. Right?
And you would think so. The grouping that's doing this Hong Kong Nicaraguan structure that's been put together for this doesn't have all of the cash on hand, apparently, that they did 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that.
It'll be interesting.
Peter Kranzauer, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.